Now we're going to talk about like beatniks, man, as in the beat generation, defined in the Oxford Dictionary as the beat generation, that is, a movement of young people in the 1950s who rejected conventional society and favored Zen Buddhism, modern jazz, free sexuality, and recreational drugs. Beatniks. Let's see what it says about beatniks. Here we go. Beatnik, noun, plural beatniks. A young person in the 1950s and early 1960s belonging to a subculture associated with the beat generation. Another source says that the term beat generation was coined by author Jack Kerouac in the early 1950s, played on a jazz slang word for people who were on the margin, people who were beat, as in they were tired, they were beaten down. At the same time, though, kind of a double meaning, they had their fingers on the nation's creative pulse. They could feel the creative beat. The stereotypical beatnik hung around in coffee houses doing performance poetry readings, drinking espresso, and perhaps going in the back room and smoking the herb. Wore berets often. The men often had beards, goatees, or soul patches, often wore sunglasses. Um, Part of the stereotype was that at these poetry readings, the audience was very laid back and would snap their fingers in time with the poet and snap their fingers in lieu of applause. And with their style of dress, their sort of slow actions, their kind of sort of a distant self-righteousness compared to the general population, and kind of an affectation of boredom with life. They could be confused for French people. However, they were singled out for ridicule. Really, they were satirized quite a bit, and they were described in very negative ways. Even Mad Magazine got in on the act. Several prominent writers, authors, and poets were closely associated with the Beat generation and the Beat movement, including Jack Kerouac, who named the movement, author of the book On the Road, the poet Allen Ginsberg, best known for his poem Howl, William S. Burroughs, author of The Naked Lunch, which is a truly weird book. And in some ways, Ken Kesey is associated with him. He wrote in the early 1960s the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And he sort of is sometimes regarded as the missing link between the beatniks and the hippies, because he sort of like came along at the tail end of the beatniks and the beginning of the hippie movement. The term beatnik came about around the same time that the Soviet Union launched the very first successful man made satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. The first time the word beatnik was used, adding that NIK to the end, was in the San Francisco Chronicle, kind of picking up steam and being used by a lot of people, kind of implying that the beat poets, that their nonconformity and countercultural approach was actually, well, communism, part of a pinko plot. Allen Ginsberg despised the term beatnik, and in fact, he wrote to complain about it to the New York Times, to complain about, quote, the foul word beatnik, saying if beatniks and not illuminated beat poets overrun this country, they will have been created not by Kerouac, but by industries of mass communication which continue to brainwash man. Probably the most famous fictional beatnik, and one of the best illustrations of the negative stereotype of the beatnik, was a character called Maynard GKrebs that was a supporting cast member in a TV show on CBS called The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis that started in 1959. Now, Dobie Gillis, there on the right, clean-cut, all-American high school boy, and basically this situation comedy was about his romantic escapades, as the title denotes, falling in love with a different girl every week or so. And Maynard GKrebs was his best friend, a beatnik, and he dressed in really ratty, tattered clothing, wore really baggy pants, was he had a little bit of a soul patch on his chin. He was constantly eating, and there weren't any direct references to marijuana culture, but that sort of was the kind of thing that would go over the heads of most kids, but grown-ups would catch on to what was being parodied there. And he was portrayed as not very bright at all and extremely lazy, to the extent that the very word work would freak him out. He was played by Bob Denver, who would go on to play Gilligan after this show went off. And a few years after Dobie Gillis went off the air in, I think, 1969, Hanna-Barbera introduced Scooby-Doo and Shaggy, who, if you'll notice, bears more than a passing resemblance in his dress and his speech, like Zoinks, and his appetites to Maynard GKrebs. So it's entirely possible that even if you weren't really very familiar with the term beatnik, you may have still grown up watching one. In fact, in the early 2000s, on the Adult Swim animated show Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, Harvey Birdman represented Shaggy and Scooby, who had gotten arrested. They got arrested after the cops pulled them over, speeding their big green van. And when they opened it up, the van was filled with mysterious smoke and fog, and they were babbling about seeing ghosts, and they were both eating a huge sandwich. When most people think about the pop culture of the 50s, they think of sitcoms like this one, Leave It to Beaver, that I bet at least some of you are at least passingly familiar with. This sort of very, very innocent kind of cardboard cutout, very safe, middle class, suburban American life. And we're going to talk about shows like that and television in general later in a different segment. But I'm mentioning this now just to sort of have a contrast, because that's what people think of in the 1950s. Well, the beat poets were in the 1950s, and they were not Leave It to Beaver. So to demonstrate that, I am now going to play a clip of Allen Ginsberg reading part of his poem Howl.
Howl for Carl Solomon. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, who, poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs, illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-light tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the wall, who got busted in their pubic beards returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York, who ate fire and paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley death, or purgatoried their torsos night after night with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls, incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind leaping toward poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between peyote solidities of halls.
So, yeah, not Leave It to Beaver. All right, one more pop culture reference to bring this discussion back full circle. Having spoken about the blacklist that started in the late 40s and was extremely, extremely powerful in the early 50s into the mid 50s, sort of started to drop off some after the fall of McCarthy, but it was still around. That is, until 1960 and Kirk Douglas, another of the all-time great movie stars, who made a film called Spartacus, in which he played the starring role and also, I think, produced the film. Spartacus, by the way, is based on an actual historical figure, a Roman slave, which is to say, not a Roman who was a slave, but a slave of the Romans, who was a gladiator, and a pretty good one, who started a rebellion, a slave revolt, that actually achieved a good degree of success to a point in that he went through the countryside, he and his group, freeing more and more slaves until they had a slave army, which then had to fight the Roman army, which was much better armed and much bigger. And of course, they lost. Now, at the end of the film, this is kind of like High Noon. It's working on two different levels. At the end of the film, when the slave army has been defeated, only a few of the slaves are still surviving, and they've been captured by the Romans. Spartacus is one of them. And the Roman commander says that he is going to be merciful and not execute them all, but he is only going to execute their leader, Spartacus. And that if someone would only identify who that was, he would execute Spartacus and let the rest of them live, but return them, of course, to slavery. At that point, Kirk Douglas, as Spartacus, steps forward and says, "I am Spartacus." The Roman commander, by the way, had said if no one identifies him, he is going to crucify all of them. So he steps forward and says, "I am Spartacus." And then his best friend also steps forward next to him and says, "No, I am Spartacus." And then slowly, one by one, all of the slaves step forward and say, "I am Spartacus." And the Roman commander executes all of them, has them all crucified, which, on the one hand, is a fate that most of them probably would have preferred to being returned to slavery. On the other hand, this show of unity was one final act of rebellion. So that's the movie. Now let's take a look at what's going on behind the scenes in the movie. First of all, the film co-starred Woody Strode the African American actor who's pictured in the lower right as one of the gladiators. It wasn't a big role, but he had a lot of presence on screen, and this helped to sort of solidify his acting career. We'll be talking more about him a little later on. But the focus right now is on the creative team behind the camera. So the film was directed by Stanley Kubrick, who was, along with Carl Foreman, who had been, along with Carl Foreman, the producer of High Noon. And the screenplay was written by Dalton Trumbo. Does that name sound vaguely familiar? Well, it should, because we talked about him not long ago. Dalton Trumbo was one of the Hollywood 10, one of those people who was called up before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947 and who refused to name names and was held in contempt and sent to prison for a year. So the first people to be blacklisted, and in their case, blacklisted really hard, including by the government, by being sent to prison. None of those folks had been able to work again since then, nor had a lot of other people who had been blacklisted, at least not openly. Some of them had gotten work behind the camera under fake names. This is what's significant about the film Spartacus, other than its artistic merit, and it has a lot of that. It also is considered one of the all-time great movies, and I highly recommend it. It's a very powerful film. But behind the screen, the fact that Kirk Douglas, who, again, not only starred in the movie but put up the money for it, not only hired Dalton Trumbo to write the screenplay, he listed him, he credited him by name on the credits at the beginning of the movie, which was unheard of for a blacklisted person, especially such a high-profile blacklisted person as Dalton Trumbo. And even though the power of the blacklist had faded some in the late 50s after the fall of McCarthy, it was still there until this movie. You see, this movie was released. Kirk Douglas made the bold decision to publicly credit Dalton Trumbo without regard for the consequences, which the consequences could have been huge. I'm pretty sure that any movie written by Dalton Trumbo under his own name 10 years before this would have been a flop because people would have refused to go see it because he's a daggum communist sympathizer pinko, right? That's not what happened in 1960. This movie was a huge, huge hit with audiences and with critics. And like I said, it's now regarded as one of the all-time great films. So Kirk Douglas took that bold step, and it paid off financially. But I have to think that's not the main reason that he did it. It was a matter of principle. And if you think back on the plot of the film I described, knowing now that it was written by one of the Hollywood 10, then this is the way that is being presented, that a rebellion should have worked, right? That everyone should stick together. And even if they go down, they should all go down together. Well, this film and the success of this film essentially broke the blacklist. There was no more blacklist after 1960. And a lot of those folks who had either had to work in secret or not been able to work at all, many of them were able to work openly again. And the irony comes in with the fact that the more time went by into the 1960s, the more people were embarrassed about the whole Red Scare, McCarthyism thing, and the more people were aware that most of them had really gone overboard and gone way too far. Then a lot of the people who were blacklisted were able to work again, but also a lot of the people who had testified against their colleagues and friends in order not to be blacklisted and to be able to keep working in the 50s became persona non grata after the blacklist was broken. They became extremely unpopular, and many of them weren't able to find work anymore. Kirk Douglas, by the way, was the father of actor Michael Douglas, whom most of you may know best as the original Ant-Man from the Marvel movies. Kirk Douglas passed away in February 2020 at the age of 103. This has been your Hollywood Moment.